yesterday. So yes, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you. Again, this is the first time I've used Zoom for giving a lecture. I thought I might be in Daytona Beach today, but I had health issues and I just couldn't make it. Interestingly, the background I had, which I did not choose, I think seems to be an ocean. Maybe that's appropriate for Daytona Beach. It was 1 year ago this week, I think, that my son, Matt, spoke to professors at Bethune Cookman. He is a research scientist at the National Lab, the Oak Ridge National Lab up in Tennessee, Oak Ridge National Lab. And he spoke and does his research on things like remote sensing and bathymetry, and how, for example, the Coast Guard can interdict Somali pirates, of all things, and then maybe eventually someday about drug smuggling in the Gulf states. But today I'm going to talk about African Americans in Florida, their history and legacy. You might wonder how I got started in this subject. And what happened was, when I came down to the University of Florida in 1969, I came down with a PhD in linguistics. And my chairman used to introduce me as an expert on how the Turkish language takes in loan words from Arabic and Persian and English and German and French and Turkifies them, makes them Turkish. But the people in Gainesville and perhaps in Daytona Beach were not interested at all in that subject. So I realized I needed to branch out. If I did not want to perish, I needed to publish. So one summer I bought a pup tent and camped my way around the state of Florida, going to as many cities, counties as I could possibly go. My family was away for the summer. I was just interested. I knew I would make Florida my home for the next number of years, and I wanted to know as much about the state as possible. So I started researching it. And then when I had a teacher, I've got 4 children, and one time a teacher of one of my children in the 4th grade called me and said, would I be interested in writing something about African Americans in Florida? Because there was nothing available for middle school or high school students that she knew about. So I said, yeah, I'd look into it, and I did, and became very much interested in the subject. Asked my African American friends at the University of Florida if they would mind if this white guy from New Jersey, me, would study and write about African Americans in the state of Florida. And they said, fine, they were not going to do it, so feel free. So then I got involved in this, and I just thought I would just do a short study, but it got really involved, and I did more and more. These are some of the publications I've done. I began with this book called Black Florida, in which I took about 20 different cities and studied the history of African Americans and how they had suffered immensely and how they overcame some of those terrible injustices. And then the second book was The Black Wax of World War II, a subject I knew nothing about, but my wife was directing a play about some black wax. And I said, well, who were the Black Wax? And the Women's Army Corps of World War II enabled African American women to join and do their service in America and England, France. And then I did a study of Lincoln High School. I'll talk about this a little bit later when in reference to one of the people from Bethune Cookman. This was one of the two or three very important African American schools in the state of Florida that enabled African American students after middle school to go on to high school and on to college. And then the one on the left is two of the people I'm going to talk about later are related to Bethune Cookman. I did a study of African Americans at the University of Florida with an African American woman, showing how the history of African Americans in the university was mixed and how some of them had a terribly hard time getting accepted. And then African American sites in Florida and African Americans in Florida are two of the works I'm going to emphasize in this talk. And then I did a study of two different groups, Greek Americans of Florida. My wife was a professor of ancient Greek at the university, and she and I spent a number of summers in Greece studying and teaching. And we decided, because of places like Tarpon Springs and Daytona Beach and Jacksonville, how important Greek Americans have made the state of Florida. And then the Native Americans in Florida was an outcropping of the work I had done in studying different groups. So my two main sources for this talk are African Americans in Florida and African American sites in Florida. As Professor Jay said, I visited all 67 counties in the state and spent several years on this project. If you notice a picture on the left of the African Americans in Florida, you may recognize the Winslow Homer painting called The Gulf Stream. And it depicts an African American in a lot of trouble. He's on a sailboat with a broken mast. There are sharks around him. In the distance, there's a waterspout approaching. And when that painting first came out, it caused a lot of anger and consternation among the public, who were quite put out because of the depiction of a man in such trouble. So as I said, we have 67 counties, most have sites of importance to African Americans. When you want to go from Escambia County in the upper left part of the state down to Key West, you realize how really far it is. So this is a study it took several years to do, not all at once, but I was determined to go to every county and see what they had in terms of the history of African Americans, the history of Native Americans, the culture, and so on, because so many people, and I can say this as a Yankee from New Jersey, so many people, I think, come down to Florida to enjoy maybe Disney World or Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy, and the beaches and the wonderful weather we have. But they don't always learn much about the culture and the history of the state. And as an outsider, I thought I could maybe contribute to the study of culture and literature and history. So what I want to do in this talk is to begin at the upper left county, Escambia, and then work my way down after talking about Tallahassee, down to the West Coast, down to the Florida Keys, and then go up the East Coast, skipping Volusia for a minute, and then going on up to Nassau and Duval, and ending with Volusia County and Daytona Beach. Just because that was an easy way to approach this study. So let's begin with the state capitol in Tallahassee. Those of you who do research in Florida studies know that the Department of State has a remarkable library, museum, and archives. The archives alone has something like 500,000 photographs that are free for scholars and anyone who wants to write about this, a subject dealing with anything in Florida's history. And the archives are adding material, videos, and documents and photographs all the time. They're available online. You can access them. When I was doing this research, I actually had to go to the library itself in Tallahassee and spend a great deal of time there. But the archivists up there were just so helpful. They allowed me to photocopy hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents dealing with African American sites. I spent so much time in front of the photocopy machine that I actually got a sunburn. My face was bright red when I went back home. It's a great source if you want to do any research on Florida history. The archives are the place to begin. Tallahassee also has Florida A&M University and a place called the Knott House, where President Lincoln's inauguration, Emancipation Proclamation was announced. FAMU, considered by some to be the second best HBCU school in Florida. Need I mention what the first is? In Daytona Beach. So if we go down a little bit, then along the West Coast, down to Levy County, we come to one of the places that has a really negative history to it. It's a very tiny, tiny settlement of Rosewood. And something took place there called the Rosewood Massacre, an attack on the predominantly African-American town of Rosewood, Florida, in 1923 by groups of white aggressors. The sign there, the plaque, exists most of the time, but from time to time it's missing as vandals will steal it as a souvenir. The picture in the middle is one of the few pictures we have showing what happened after the massacre, when there was basically nothing left. And the African Americans who lived there, worked there, went to school there, had to flee because there was, for example, a vigilante mob from Cedar Key on its way by train to drive out the people of Rosewood. There's very little left there now. And that is similar to the town of Ocoee in Orange County. The Rosewood Massacre was similar to what happened in Ocoee in Orange County in 1920. And you see the map where it is in Central Florida. A white mob attacked African-American residents. By most estimates, a total of 30 to 80 Black people were killed during what has been considered the single bloodiest day in modern American political history. And if you go to Ocoee these days, you will find very few African Americans there. They have not been comfortable enough to return, even after all these years. Further down in the Florida Keys is an example that I use of a shipwreck. The Henrietta Marie was a slave ship that carried captive Africans to the West Indies, where they were sold as slaves. The ship wrecked at the southern tip of Florida on its way home to England, and is one of only a few wrecks of slave ships that have been identified. And those of you who are divers on ships know that if you can find the bell or some name, some piece of wood that indicates the name of the ship, you're in luck. You may know that off Daytona Beach, there was a very famous shipwreck, the Commodore, that is a central player in what I think is perhaps the best American short story, The Open Boat by Stephen Crane, that took place about 12 miles off the lighthouse. The shackles that were found were not only used for adults, but also for children. So we know there were children there. The slaves had all been taken off before the ship arrived in Florida waters. So the slaves were taken to islands in the Bahamas and then the northern part of South America. This is where it wrecked, over here. So Key West, Marquesas, and so on. This is also where perhaps the most famous shipwreck took place there, the Atocha, that Mel Fisher, the treasure hunter, found after about 10 years of looking. But the Henrietta Marie wrecked someplace in here, and when divers found it and found the bell with its name, they knew what it was. And there are such good records, both in England and in Cuba, and especially in Spain, in the Spanish archives in Seville, that they were able to find a record of the ship. In May 1993, the National Association of Black Scuba Divers placed a memorial plaque on the site of Henrietta Marie. The plaque faces the African shore, thousands of miles away, and has the name of the slave ship and reads, quote, "In memory and recognition of the courage, pain, and suffering of enslaved African people, speak her name and gently touch the souls of our ancestors." So the ship was first used in the African trade, the Atlantic slave trade, made at least 2 other voyages carrying Africans to slavery in the West Indies. On its first voyage, the ship carried more than 200 people from Africa that were sold as slaves. This is a book I wrote about shipwrecks, and it has a whole chapter dealing with the Henrietta Marie as a typical slave ship. And we may not think that much of Florida in terms of slaves being imported, but they were, as we'll see in a few minutes, up in the northeastern part. Down in Key West, the African cemetery at Higgs Beach is a cemetery in Key West, Florida, where nearly 300 Africans were buried in 1860. And you can see the plaque there, right close to the water. There is a beautiful monument here, a map down in here. In 1860, the U.S. Navy intercepted 3 ships that held 1,432 Africans and were engaging in the illicit slave trade. The Africans were rescued and held in quarantine. During this time, 294 people died and were buried at Higgs Beach. For a long time, this site was not known exactly where it was, until finally some archaeologists found out where it was and put a plaque up, a small appropriate monument there, dealing with the fact that there were many slaves handed off in Key West in the slave trade. The cemetery was discovered in 2002 using ground penetrating radar. In 2012, was added to the National Register of Historic Places. There are plaques like this all over Florida, and they're being added to every year as archaeologists and historians and local researchers see which sites are important to different ethnic groups, whether African Americans or Native Americans, Greek Americans, and so on. So this is right next to the water down near Key West. Many Black Seminoles made their way south to what is today Billbags, Cape Florida State Recreation Area near Key Biscayne, and escaped by boat to the Bahamas. The Black Seminoles were a group of Native Americans who intermarried with African Americans throughout Florida. So they were escaping south, often from plantations in the Carolinas, and the Seminoles welcomed them, were able to use the skills of the plantation slaves who had learned English. In 2004, a large historical marker was erected at the site to mark it as part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Trail, as hundreds of Black Seminoles, many fugitive slaves, escaped from here to freedom in the Bahamas, settling mostly on Andros Island. So that's a picture of the lighthouse down in Key Biscayne. You may be able to see the little lighthouse keeper's house there. If you're really eagle-eyed, you can see chimneys poking out of the house down there. And you may think, well, why were builders building a place down in the southern part of Florida with chimneys? And the answer was a lot of lighthouse keepers' houses were cookie cutters based on the models in New England lighthouses and lighthouse keepers' houses. But this lighthouse, I wrote a book about Florida lighthouses, and this has perhaps the most interesting story of any of the lighthouses, how the Seminoles attacked the lighthouse keepers in there. And one of the two keepers who died in that lighthouse was an African American. And how that story came about is quite interesting. Anyway, we normally think of slaves heading north on the Underground Railroad, but there were a whole lot of them who escaped south to Florida. Fort Pierce is the final resting place of distinguished author Zora Neale Hurston, 1891 to 1960. So right above West Palm Beach is this delightful town of Fort Pierce. When Zora Neale Hurston briefly taught at Bethune Cookman College in 1934, she lived aboard a boat. She may have lived, in fact, on 2 houseboats in the Halifax River in Daytona Beach. This is where she may be buried, in Fort Pierce. We say may because Alice Walker, the novelist, spent much time looking for the gravesite of Zora Neale Hurston and finally determined that the unmarked grave may be at this very site. It's called the Garden of Heavenly Rest in Fort Pierce or 14th Avenue. Hurston is widely considered one of the most significant authors of the 20th century. These are 3 of her novels. There's a picture of her on the left. Their Eyes Were Watching God may be the most famous one. It has a very good description of the 1928 hurricane that ravaged South Florida. West Palm Beach has a huge gravesite that was unmarked for a long time. This is West Palm Beach up here. The hurricane in 1928, African-American mass burial site, also known as Pauper Cemetery, is the Pauper Cemetery and Mass Grave in West Palm Beach. So we know, historians tell us that that is the site where hundreds of African Americans were buried after the hurricane, unidentified, just in a big mass grave. The site is a location in which 674 bodies of African Americans of those of unknown race were buried following the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, while most of the white victims of the storm received a proper burial at Woodlawn Cemetery due to segregation laws. During the 75th anniversary of the storm's landfall in September 2003, a historical marker was added by the city of West Palm Beach. It is emblematic of the efforts of local communities to tell visitors where important sites, both good and bad, were in Florida. Let me go back just a minute to, I want to say one final thing about Zora Neale Hurston. When she was working down in Fort Pierce, she lived in this small house, 1734. When she died, her landlord came in, saw lots of papers around, because after all, Miss Hurston was a writer, took the papers outside and began to burn them. A neighbor came along, saw what was happening, that this landlord was burning papers, realized there might have been some important manuscripts there, used a fire extinguisher to put out the fire, retrieved the remnants of what was left. For example, on the right, you see a scorched manuscript from that fire, totally protected now. It's in the library at the University of Florida. It's an unfinished manuscript that Hurston was writing about Herod the Great. But researchers now can go there and actually touch the manuscript because it's totally protected with that price over it. Now, up in Nassau County, now going up, going to skip over Volusia for a minute, go up to Nassau County, very tip. After the Jeffersonian embargo of 1807 and the Slave Importation Act of 1808, Amelia Island and Fernandina became popular ports for smuggling slaves into Georgia. Because remember that Florida was still controlled by the Spanish. And America did not buy Florida from the Spanish until the early 1820s, around 1821. At that point, Florida became part of the United States and had to follow all of its laws. But meanwhile, there was a lot of smuggling down into northeastern Florida and then across the St. Mary's River up into Georgia. So this was a way that slaves, pictured over on the right, packed in slave ships, were smuggled into the southern United States. American Beach above Jacksonville on Amelia Island. This is important for Daytona Beach, so I'll explain in a minute. During the time of segregation in the Jim Crow era, African Americans were denied access to many public amenities, such as public pools and beaches. The African American owner of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, thought that African Americans should have their own beach. So he bought, at his own expense, a lot of land, which he named American Beach, and it became a very popular place for African Americans to visit free of segregation. Abraham Lincoln Lewis, Florida's first Black millionaire and president of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, founded American Beach as a resort community that was visited mostly by African Americans, though all were welcome. There's a plaque there, you see on the right, established in 1935. There are some houses still there from the 1920s and 30s, but it's now totally integrated and not just African Americans. A little further south of there is a place called Fort Mose, M-O-S-E. In 1738, the Spanish built Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, shortened to Fort Mose, military fort about 2 miles north of St. Augustine. This is the fort, the Castillo in St. Augustine, protected by these offshore islands, still going strong. And this is where Fort Mose was located, in a swamp about 2 miles north of this. Is the north up here. And this is what's interesting. Any fugitive slaves discovered by the Spanish were directed to head there. Now, the Spanish said go south when the Spanish caught the slaves in the Carolinas. If the slaves accepted Catholicism and were baptized with Christian names, and those capable served in the colonial militia, the Spanish treated them as free. A very important site. You'll notice then that this is north of the Castillo, north of St. Augustine, which was around here. And that was meant to be a buffer that the Spanish set up to keep away the English who were in Georgia. And this is a reconstructed fort of what Fort Mose looked like. The problem is it's in swampy area. There's not much there now, except this little hummock with a sign out front, Fort Mose Historic State Park. There is going to be a boardwalk built there from the highway. Display is put there of that site. A really important site in the history of African Americans in North Florida. Now, Volusia County, which you know better than I do, has a number of sites important to African Americans, including Bethune Cookman College, Lady University. Mary McLeod Bethune, 1875 to 1955, helped found the school. And I'm sure you know the story of Mary Bethune. It was founded in 1904 by Mary McLeod Bethune. At the time, Dr. Bethune had all of, actually, I think it's $1.50 instead of 150. 5 little girls, a son Albert, but most importantly, a strong faith in God. So she established this little school with girls and her son, and it morphed into the very prestigious college, university, where you are now. The school eventually became Bethune Cookman University, and each year graduates several thousand students from around America and the world. And this is a picture from the archives of Mary McLeod Bethune with a group of students in 1943. And the Performing Arts Center over here. You perhaps know that Mary Bethune was born in South Carolina, went to school in North Carolina and Georgia, basically taught herself how to read, was one of, I think, 17 children. She was the 15th child. But she realized that education was the key to getting ahead. So it's the football team, as you know, and band have also made the school well known in the Southeast. And I have friends who, African American friends, who would rather go to a game at BCU than the Gators or the Seminoles in Tallahassee and so on, because the spirit is so wonderful during a football game. The statue of Mary McLeod Bethune was unveiled at the National Statuary Hall at the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday, July 13, 2022. It replaced a statue of Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith, who had nothing to do with Florida. Her statue is one of two representing Florida. Anyone know what the other statue represents? I'm hoping you're cheering and shouting out the name of the other person. John Gorey. This is John Gorey, the physician and scientist credited as the inventor of mechanical refrigeration, which gave us air conditioning. He is from Apalachicola, and every state is allowed to have two people representing the state. And we had for a while this Confederate General, Edmund Kirby Smith. And finally, people realized that was inappropriate. There was a contest held about who should represent Florida in place of him, and Mary McLeod Bethune rightly won out. The Black Rose inspired reflections on diversity, individuality, and peaceful interracial growth, and she began to refer to the students at her college as Black Roses. But her garb as an educator was appropriate because that's what she considered herself primarily, an educator. She had very important roles to play in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. She became a personal friend of Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who came down to dedicate one of the parts of the campus there in Daytona Beach. And the two women became close friends. And now the last thing I want to talk about is one Bethune Cookman administrator teacher and two students. And these are the two books I wrote about the two students. This is a man you may recognize, I hope, as Virgil Hawkins. The administrative teacher in April 1949, Virgil Hawkins, a director of public relations for Bethune Cookman College, applied for admission to the University of Florida College of Law. He was academically eligible and possessed appropriate life experience qualifications, but it was denied over and over and over again because of his race. At the time, this was the UF College of Law on the campus. For 9 years, Hawkins and his allies would fight Florida's Jim Crow laws, which racially segregated its state universities until they were ultimately victorious in the U.S. Supreme Court, but that still did not matter. UF denied admission to Hawkins and 5 other African-American applicants in May of 1949, solely based on race. Hawkins appealed under the Equal Protection Clause to the Florida Supreme Court, but it did not prevail. The court in Tallahassee instead required Florida to build a law school for Black students at Florida A&M University. Between 1948 and 1956, 85 African-American students were denied admission to UF. The Supreme Court ordered UF to admit Hawkins. UF said no. The president said, no, we're not going to admit any African Americans, even if the Supreme Court tells us to do what you did. He was still not admitted and would go before the Supreme Court 3 more times and the United States Supreme Court twice more. Each time UF refused to admit him. It's one of the blackest marks, in my opinion, on the history of the University of Florida, because they were ordered to admit this qualified man, but refused. Virgil Hawkins Monument in Leesburg, Florida, near where he was from. If you go to Leesburg, you will see this is right in front of a private house, and it's near where he's buried. And you can see on the monument a brick wall depicted, and that represents the University of Florida keeping out all African American students. Hawkins, a really great man, in 1958 withdrew his application to the University of Florida College of Law in exchange for a Florida Supreme Court order desegregating U.S. graduate and professional schools. So Virgil Hawkins said, I give up. In 1958, I will no longer apply to the UF Law School if the UF agrees to admit undergraduates to its main campus. And it did. Secondly, W. George Allen became the first African American to graduate from the University of Florida College of Law in 1962. So 4 years after Virgil Hawkins withdrew his application, this man from Fort Lauderdale graduated from the UF College of Law, the first 7 African American undergraduates registered at UF. This is W. George Allen, and this is Stephan Mickle, the second person I want to talk about. Stephan Mickle became the first undergraduate to graduate from UF in 1965, and the second African American to graduate from UF Law. Judge Mickle, 1944 to 2021, was Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida. My wife and I were teaching one time in Spain. We got an email from Judge Mickle, whom I had met briefly, and he said, McCarthy, I want to see you in my chambers when you come back from overseas. I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. But he said, no, I want you to write my biography. So I did. I visited him extensively in his home. I went to where he grew up in Daytona Beach and also where he grew up in South Carolina. And I wrote his biography. His father, I want to say just a word about his father. Stephan was born in New York City in 1944, while his father, Andrew, was deployed in the U.S. Army right after D-Day as part of the Red Ball Express. This may be something that a lot of people don't realize, but the Red Ball Express was a very effective truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces moving quickly through Europe after breaking out from the D-Day beaches in Normandy in 1944. African Americans were not allowed to be ordinary soldiers for quite a while during World War II, but they were allowed to be truck drivers. And the Red Ball Express was something that they became skilled at. You can see them driving through the mud. General George Patton, the great general in the U.S. Army, said if he had more African American drivers like Andrew Mickle, he could have won the war more quickly. After the war, Andrew enrolled at Bethune Cookman, lived with his wife in married student housing, which consisted of a Quonset hut, and began raising a family. Stephan went to Campbell Street Elementary School in Daytona. And this is a picture of the school that Stephan went to. I visited the school. It's now still, I think, an educational school. Stephan's mother and father, Andrew, Later accepted a job at Lincoln High School in Gainesville and moved there to teach at the school. Andrew would be named in 1972 Alachua County Teacher of the Year. And this was a picture of Lincoln High School, the one I mentioned earlier, in Gainesville, one of the very, very few African-American schools in Florida in the 40s and 50s. Andrew had a pool built at his house. This is at Andrew Mickle, the father of Stephan. He bought an old school bus to transport children to his house after school, and he taught thousands of African-American children, including Stephan, how to swim. Some of the students won swimming scholarships at universities, and I put an arrow here next to the name of Albert White, who co-authored with me a history of Lincoln High School. Albert White got a swimming scholarship to Georgia State University up in Atlanta and was able to put himself through school as a swimmer. Andrew Mickle was one of the most important people I've ever met in my 50 years in Florida. He was truly dedicated to helping African Americans. After graduating from Lincoln in 1961, Stephan decided to go to Bethune Cookman for college, which he thoroughly enjoyed. After his freshman year there, his father convinced him to transfer to the University of Florida, from which he graduated after 3 years. He became the first African American to graduate from UF. He did not want to leave Bethune Cookman. He said to his parents, "I really like this school a lot in Daytona Beach. I've got good friends there. Why would I want to go to this big university in Gainesville where I'd be the only African American in my classes and on the campus?" But he went anyway. The other student I want to mention is Carl Joseph, a star athlete with an unusual characteristic. He had only one leg. This was a young man I met about 15 years ago. He's from Madison, Florida. Has, for all his life, he's in his 50s now, has had only the right leg. He earned 8 letters in 3 sports at Madison High School. He started at nose guard in football his sophomore year. Was named Big Ben Player of the Week for 7 solo tackles and 4 assists during a game. As you can imagine, players like Carl Joseph were not allowed to use a prosthetic during a game for fear that he could take off the prosthetic and bop somebody over the head with it. So he had to hop every time he was in any kind of game, whether basketball, shown here, or football. He was not allowed to use a prosthetic. As a junior, he was named Lineman of the Week for recovering 3 fumbles and making 4 solo tackles. Also a starter his senior year. Joseph had 11 solo tackles and assists in the season opener. His best game was his senior homecoming contest, in which he recovered a key fumble, knocked down 2 passes, had 8 solo tackles, and 6 assists. And there's his picture as a Wildcat. Whenever a high school opponent or even a college opponent heard that they were going to play a football player with only one leg, they said, "We're going to roll over this guy. We're going to take advantage of him." Little did they know how strong he was, and his leg became stronger and stronger. He was actually a high jumper. Think of the Olympics, which just ended. With one leg, he could high jump 6'5". In basketball, Joseph averaged 10 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 block shots over 20 games of the junior varsity team. He could actually high jump 6'5". He could dunk the basketball. With only one leg, he could still dunk the ball. The way he would high jump would be he would run up to the bar on one leg, spin around with his back to the bar, leap over the bar backwards. And that's the way he high jumped. Again, 6'5", he was able to high jump. After high school, he was invited by Jackie Sherrill, then head football coach for the University of Pittsburgh, to become manager of the football team during the 80-81 school year. Joseph returned to Florida and played linebacker and lineman for Bethune Cookman College in Daytona Beach. I actually found when I was here several years ago in Daytona Beach, I found the former head football coach who had been at Bethune Cookman, who had been a classmate and teammate of Carl Joseph. This is a picture of Carl, always tell with just a one leg, playing at Madison High School. And the coach was amazed at how much Carl Joseph could do with only one leg. If you ever get a chance, go on YouTube to look up Carl Joseph football player, and you will see a video of Carl hopping on one leg into the backfield of the opponents and tackling the runner. He was named the most courageous athlete of 1981 by the Philadelphia Sports Writers Association and is the subject of a biography, Carl Joseph, Some Call Me Superstar. I wrote this with Carl, and he was such a pleasure to work with. He lives now in, I think, Tallahassee. Carl later became a preacher in Tallahassee and became a member of a singing group called Elder Carl Joseph and the Spiritual Gospel True Tones. So he's always been on one leg. His mom used to insist he wear a prosthetic, and he would do it while he was inside of her. But on his way to school, when he was out of sight of his mom, he would take off the prosthetic, put it under his arm, and hop down to the bus stop. He's managed all these years just on one leg. Finally, a few final comments about Daytona Beach, Jackie Robinson Ballpark and Museum down near the center of town. The statue of Jackie with 2 children, one black, one white, representing integration. The wall behind the 3 figures curves around and is meant to represent the ripples in a pond, meaning you drop a pebble in a pond and it cascades outwards. You don't know how far the ripples will go and what influence such an integration like this will have. I was going to ask you if I had been there in person, I would have asked you, what uniform does Jackie wear in the statue in front of the ballpark in his name? And if you see carefully, it's the Montreal Royals, because they were the farm team of the Dodgers. So before he broke into the majors in '47, he was relegated to the farm team. Finally, the last thing I want to mention, I contacted the superintendent of the DeKalb County school system in Georgia, asked about the Mary Bethune School. I found out that there are about a half a dozen schools throughout the United States that are named after Mary McLeod Bethune. So I've begun to write to them to see, why did you name the school after this great woman? Is there any connection with the school? The area superintendent answered my queries. The Bethune family cut the ribbon during the school erection. Over the years, a granddaughter has come to the building to read and speak to students during Black History Month. Once a year, the granddaughter NAACP affiliation would come to speak to 8th graders and provide them with history. Principal Butler has been in contact with the family to continue the partnership with the school. So every year, one member of the Bethune family goes up to the DeKalb County school system and participates in ceremonies honoring her during Black History Month. I thought that was neat. I'm going to try to find out what other schools do in her honor. This is my last slide. The African-American legacy in Florida has its good points and its bad points, the latter the result of discrimination and prejudice. And because of schools like Bethune Cookman and Florida A&M and Edward Waters College up in Jacksonville, there are several down in Miami, they are able to graduate thousands of African Americans, and these young men and women go out into the world as productive citizens. So those of you at Bethune-Cookman today have a lot to be proud of. Your school is thriving, and it's been my pleasure to, if not in person, at least come to talk to you about what I have discovered about the long legacy and history of African Americans in Florida. I think that's, but thanks to schools like Bethune-Cookman, FAMU, Edward Waters, and others, that legacy should have a bright future. It's about 45, almost an hour I've talked now. And I don't know if there are any questions. Maybe Professor Jay can tell